You're listening to the Nutrition Experts Podcast, featuring guests who take the scientific talk about food and break it down for practical use. You've heard the phrase, "you are what you eat." Come find out what that really means. Experience conversations with experts in the field of nutrition and understand the power of food for our health, well-being, and beyond. Now, here's your host, registered dietitian and nutritionist, Mathia Ford.
Hi there, it's Mathia. Welcome back to the Nutrition Experts Podcast. The podcast featuring nutrition experts who are leading the way using food starts today, right now, with our next guest. It's great to have Dr. Glenn Livingston on the show today. Welcome to Nutrition Experts.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this, Mathia.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about binge eating, which is something I haven't talked a whole lot about on the show. But I want to start with letting you tell my listeners a little more about you and what you do.
Well, I guess what you should know about me is that I'm not just a doctor who decided to work with people that were struggling with their eating. I'm someone that had a very difficult struggle with my own eating for a good deal of my life. All the way back to, I was a weird kid with food. My mother used to give me a whole box of Pop-Tarts for breakfast every morning and a whole box of Sugar Pops for lunch every afternoon. So that was the way that I was brought up. I don't think I saw a vegetable until I was 16 or 17 years old. But I figured out that if I worked out a lot, it didn't matter, or at least it didn't matter to my weight. When I was 17 or 18, I would work out 2 or 3 hours a day, and I'd have 6, 7, 8,000 calories every single day. Boxes of Pop-Tarts, boxes of chocolate bars, boxes of pizza, boxes of muffins, boxes of donuts. I guess you could say I like boxes. And I was fine with it, except for all the time that I was wasting. But I was spending a lot of time eating, a lot of time recovering from food, and a lot of time exercising. That lifestyle didn't work for me when I was a little older and I got married and I had responsibilities and I was commuting 2 hours each way. I just couldn't work out like that. My metabolism was slowing down a little bit. I couldn't stop eating the same way that I was. I found that I just got used to it, and these foods had a life of their own. And I started gaining weight. And, my top weight was probably around 280. I'm guessing I was telling you beforehand. The number on the scale was 257 the last time I weighed myself because I got fed up with it after that. And worse yet, my triglycerides were going through the roof. I know I have a test around 826. I remember them being over 1,100 and the doctor just flipping out and saying, "Look, you're going to die if you don't do something before you're 35. You really just got to figure this out." But I couldn't. I just kept on. I'd be sitting with suicidal patients and I would be thinking, when can I get my next pizza? Or a couple who just recovered from an affair, and it was really hard to be 100% present. And that bothered me a lot because I was from a family of psychologists, and being a great psychologist was first and foremost what was in my soul. So I tried to solve it in what you might expect the way a psychologist would try to solve it. I tried to solve it by loving myself thin. I said, it's not what I'm eating. I must have a hole in my heart. And if I could fill the hole in my heart, then I'll be okay. And so I went to workshops and eating disorder specialists and all the best psychologists and psychiatrists around Manhattan. I took medication. I went to Overeaters Anonymous. Everything you could imagine, which was a very soulful journey, which I don't regret. But in terms of the results, I'd get a little better, and then I get a lot worse, and a little better, and a lot worse. Finally, there were 3 things that changed the paradigm. It made me think that rather than trying to love myself thin, what I really needed to do was act like an alpha wolf in a pack who was being challenged for leadership by one of the pack members. I needed to come to think of the urges as coming from a bodily organ, and later I learned that it actually comes from the reptilian brain. I'll see that in a minute. But when you think about how an alpha wolf deals with a challenger for leadership, it doesn't say, "Oh my goodness, someone needs a hug." It says, "Get back in line or I'll kill you." Like snarls and growls and "get back in line or I'll kill you." And I thought, well, gee, it's not all that different than the urges that are generated by my bladder or my testicles. Like they're very strong biological urges, but I'm not in the middle of a conference where I just decide I'm going to pee. I'll get up and go to the bathroom and express it in a particular way at a particular time. I don't just run up to attractive women on the street and kiss them. You have to approach them in a very particular way or not at all and restrain those urges because of the person you want to be in society, right? So I said, what's the difference? Why can't I just define what restraint actually means and take control? Two other things happened that made it really clear to me that that was a better paradigm than loving myself then. The first one was I read a book called Rational Recovery by Jack Trimpey. And he works largely with drug and alcohol addicts, and he helps them to, I call them the black and white addictions. They're the things that you can give up entirely, as opposed to food where you have to take the lion out of the cage and walk it around the block a couple of times a day. What he basically pointed out was that addiction comes from the reptilian brain. And what I knew about neurology was that the reptilian brain doesn't know love. The reptilian brain, whether you want to believe it evolved this way or God put it there, it doesn't really matter. What it knows when it sees something in the environment is, do I eat it? Do I mate with it? Or do I kill it? Eat, mate, or kill. There's no love there. There's the sense of love that came later with the higher portions of the brain. The mammalian brain that says, hey, before you eat, mate, or kill that thing, what impact does it have on your tribe or your family or those that you love? Or the neocortex, what we think of as the more human brain, which says we can really delay gratification to think about our long-term goals and plans and what does this mean for the kind of person that we want to be, for love and spirituality and music and art and who we want to be in the world, how we want to cooperate with society and fit in. And so I realized that I had to think of my human identity as sitting in my neocortex and above the reptilian brain, and that's what was in control. That the urges might be part of me, but they really weren't me. Just like my bladder is part of me and my testicles are part of me, but they're not really me. Two other things that happened. I was doing a lot of consulting for the food industry. I never had kids and I never commuted, so I had a lot of time to do two careers. And I consulted for big food and big pharma. Kind of wish I didn't, but I did. And I knew that they were putting billions of dollars into engineering hyper-palatable concentrations of starch and salt and sugar and oil and excitotoxins and basically these food-like substances which are designed to hit our bliss points in the reptilian brain and not give us the nutrition we need to feel satisfied. Beyond that, they were putting billions into advertising, and most people think advertising doesn't affect them. But believe me, it does. It affects you more when you think it doesn't affect you, because then your sales resistance is down. And there, depending on what study you look at, between 5,000 and 7,000 messages beamed at us over the airwaves about food every day, the airwaves and the internet, every year about food. And how many of them do you think are about eating more raw fruits and vegetables? They're not. They're mostly about eating more of these bags and boxes and containers and mechanisms of industrial profit. And I remember talking to a food bar manufacturer, a VP, who explained to me that their biggest insight was to remove the vitamins from the bar and make the packaging look good instead. Because the vitamins were expensive and they made the bar taste not as good, whereas the packaging could make people believe that it was healthier. Have a vibrance of colors and a diversity of colors and like a bright, shiny packaging, which in nature, a bright, shiny salad with green lettuce and red tomatoes and yellow carrots and purple cabbage, that would signal a diversity of nutrients. So I said, you mean your most profitable insight was to fake people out? And he kind of got a little sheepish and he said, yeah. And I don't mean to single out the food bar industry because this happens all over the place. So I said there are these very powerful forces aligned against us. The addiction treatment industry is telling us that we can't resist even if we wanted to, that these urges are irresistible and that you were actually powerless over them, and the only hope you had was to admit that you were powerless over them and abstain one day at a time. And there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that that's true. The evidence is more on the side that people can choose to abstain if they want to abstain, that addicts can restrain themselves if they want to. And the only scientific studies that were quasi-scientific studies ever conducted about this addiction treatment suggest that it's either at parity or worse than doing nothing at all. So I said, okay, so there are these immense forces aligned against us. Everybody's telling me to love myself thin. I've been trying that for 30 years. It didn't work. If anybody would know how to love themselves thin, it would be a psychologist from a family of 17 psychologists who'd seen all these psychologists, right? I said, here's what I'm going to do. This is the embarrassing part. I decided that I was going to, remember, I was never going to publish this. This is just a private journal. I said, my reptilian brain, I'm going to call that my inner pig. I'm going to make a really clear line that delineates what's healthy food and what's not healthy food for me. What does eating with restraint really mean to me? And so I said something like, I will never have chocolate Monday to Friday again. I'll only ever have it on the weekend. That's just an example. I did all kinds of things. Then I said, if there's a voice in my head that suggests that I should have the chocolate because, gee, you worked out hard enough today, Glenn, you can afford it, doesn't matter, or you could start tomorrow, or chocolate comes from a cocoa bean which grows in a plant and therefore it's a vegetable. All of that was pig squeal. I would say, my pig is squealing for its slop. I don't want that. My pig does. And I don't listen to farm animals telling me what to do. I'm so embarrassed that that's what worked. I wish it was one of the deep psychological insights that I had, or soulful journeys, or meditation. It's not. It was, I don't eat pig slop. I don't let farm animals tell me what to do. It wasn't a miracle. I wish I could tell you it got better right away. I didn't. What it would do is it would give me those extra microseconds at the moment of impulse to remember who I was and why I made the rule in the first place. And that way I could make a conscious choice. Sometimes I didn't make the right choice, but I stopped feeling overrun by this mysterious force inside. I stopped feeling helpless and hopeless and powerless, and I started to feel hopeful right away. And over time, I experimented with different rules. I kept a journal about what the pig would say and why it was wrong, how the pig would lie to me. For example, when it says, you can start again tomorrow, it doesn't matter. Well, neurologically speaking, that's not true. If you reinforce the urge today, you're going to be in a deeper hole tomorrow. Those grooves are going to have been worn even deeper. It's going to be harder to dig yourself out. If you're in a hole, stop digging. That's the first thing you want to do. Or, if the pig would say, go ahead and try this. I can't get you now, but I'll get you later. You're going to forget later. I would say, well, the only time you can eat is now. So if I always use the present moment to be healthy, then you can never get me. And besides, you don't have a time machine any more than I do. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow any more than I do. So I had all these interesting dialogues which would expose the logical fallacies in my pig's attacks, the reasons that it wanted me to break them. And I fully recognized that I couldn't totally get rid of the pig. There was always going to be this voice in my head that would say those things. But I also realized that I could recognize it. I got a lot of this from Jack Trimpe also, but I just had to modify things tremendously to make it work with food. I could recognize and ignore it because it didn't matter if by definition my pig's voice was any thought, feeling, or impulse which suggested that I would either now or in the future have one bite, taste, or swallow off of my carefully constructed plan, then by definition anything the pig said was wrong, was malintended. And so, like Jodie Foster arguing with Hannibal Lecter, there was no purpose to arguing, even if it seemed like he had a Ph.D. from Harvard. I'm sorry, I'm sweating a little because I'm all excited and it's hot here. But like arguing with Hannibal Lecter, there's no real point because it's malintended. The whole point is to throw you off balance and get you to break your rule. So slowly but surely, I recovered. I lost the weight. I hover between 200 and 210 these days. I used to be as much as 280. I think I said that in the beginning. I used to have high triglycerides. Those came down. I used to have eczema and psoriasis and rosacea. And I don't think you can see that on me anymore. Maybe a dermatologist can make the diagnosis, but it doesn't bother me and it doesn't affect my appearance that much. That's what happened. I wasn't going to publish it. A whole series of events happened, including getting divorced. And I decided through a minor publishing company that I was a part of to publish it as a test, and it just took off. We've got 600,000 readers and almost 2,000 reviews, including people who hate us. Like as you were telling me before the interview, there's probably 10% of the people that think this is horrible, and they call me Dr. Sensitivity. They think sarcastically I'm just not being sensitive to people's struggles. And that's my story. That's who I am and what I do, and now I focus on that.
That's very interesting because I had a podcast a couple weeks ago that we talked about this like neuroplasticity and basically how you change and how your brain works with creating new pathways and how hard it is to change that. And so it sounds to me like you kind of used that information, and obviously the things that help us to have better brains are things that are like whole grains, whole fruits, whole vegetables that are full of antioxidants to help your brain. So
it's not the bags and boxes and containers, I'll tell you that much.
No, it is not. So going back a little bit to what we were talking about, this overeating cycle, you mentioned kind of it started in your childhood. What starts people in that overeating cycle most of the time?
I'm not sure it matters, because I think once they do start, that they have a life of their own. I'll tell you a story. I did this 40,000 person study over the course of about 5 years when internet clicks were cheap. And I asked people what foods they struggled with. Like if they started eating them, they couldn't stop. And what was troubling them in their life. And I found 3 interesting things. People who started their binges with chocolate like me, they tended to be lonely or brokenhearted. And I was in a bad marriage, so that kind of made sense. People who struggled with salty, crunchy things like pretzels and chips, they tended to be stressed at work. And people who struggled with soft, chewy things like bread and bagels, they tended to be stressed at home. And I thought, this is really interesting. I bet there's something to this. So let me go investigate my own history. Thankfully, I have a mother who is a psychotherapist. She passed away a year and a half ago. And I called her and I said, Mom, what is it in my history that could have set up? I mean, I know I'm got some struggles in my love life and whatever, but what is it in my history that would have set up this pattern? And she gets this horrible look on her face and this horrible sound in her voice. She goes, I'm so sorry, Glenn. I am so sorry. I go, Mom, what is it? So I said, I forgive you. Whatever it is, it's okay. I forgive you. It's 40 years later now. And she said, well, when you were about 1 in 1965, your father was a captain in the army, and they were really talking about sending him to Vietnam. And we were working really hard to have another baby. Hopefully they weren't going to do that, but I was terrified they were going to send him anyway. And I thought I could wind up as a single mom with 2 kids, and what am I going to do? And I was really terrified. At the same time, my father, your grandfather, he just got out of prison, and he was guilty. And I had idolized him my whole life. He was the one and only saving grace in my upbringing, and he was guilty. And I was just falling apart. And half the time I was sitting and staring at the wall. And I didn't have a good therapist then. I didn't have anybody to talk to. And I didn't have the wherewithal to hold you and love you and feed you when you came running to me. So half the time at least, I would say, Glenn, go get your Bosco. And there would be a refrigerator on the floor with a big bottle of chocolate Bosco syrup. And you go running over to the refrigerator, you take it out, you go crawling over to the refrigerator, you take it out, you suck on the bottle, and you go into a chocolate sugar coma. And I thought, Eureka, this is it. This is why I go to chocolate when I'm upset. And you would think, if this were the movies, that Mom and I would have a big hug and a big cry, and I would never struggle with chocolate again, right? Would you believe me if I told you my chocolate eating got worse?
Yes.
Do you want to guess why?
Probably because now you're upset about you felt like you had less control over it.
That's true. The reason it got worse was there was this crazy voice in my head, which I now know was my inner pig. And it said something like this. Hey, Glenn, you know what? You're right. Our mama didn't love us enough. And she left a great big chocolate-sized hole in our heart. And until we can find the love of our life, we're going to have to go right on binging. Yippee, let's go get some right now. So there is this voice of justification that seized on the opportunity to use the emotional conflict and the emotional release as a cause for binging more. And this was right around the time I was having the insights about having to switch my paradigm. And I realized that emotions aren't really a problem. It doesn't necessarily matter why I have this raging fire inside. A raging fire in a well-constructed fireplace in the center of a home can become the center of hearth and home. That's where people tell stories. That's where they gather. That's where they find their peace. The problem is when the fireplace can't contain it. And the pig, this voice of justification, is busy poking holes in the fireplace so the fire can escape and burn down the house so you can actually have a binge. And I realized it was going to be a lot quicker to recognize and disempower that voice of justification than to fix the emotional issues. I mean, do you know how long it takes in psychotherapy for someone with this particular problem to solve it? Like, how long does it take to find the love of your life? Some people never do. How long does it take to come to terms with the fact that, your mother was really traumatized and couldn't love you in the way that she needed to, and so therefore she left this hole in your heart? that can take a very long time, 5 to 10 years. I've certainly come to a place where I can forgive her and love her for everything she went through. I don't have a love of my life. I can't say that I'm solved. And if I had to fix that before I stopped binging, I would, be 400 pounds now. So what causes it? You can investigate the foods that you eat. You can go back and look at your history. It's a soulful journey to take. There were good things that came out of it. My mom and I forgave each other. I was softer on myself about the mistakes that I did make. It was easier for me to forgive myself after a binge and get back on track a little quicker. So it helped a little bit. But what helped a whole lot more was recognizing that crazy voice and disempowering it. And most people don't want to spend 5 or 10 years in psychotherapy to figure it all out. Most people just want to stop binging.
What you're talking about is not necessarily positive thinking, but maybe more along the lines of changing the way you think about things. So instead of feeling that victim and powerless and like you said, your reptilian brain just kind of got you to eat, you start telling yourself a different story, which is what you were doing, telling yourself this different story about who you were. You're not that person that binge eats.
Right. So really, rather than making a Nazi rule, which is how a lot of people look at what I'm telling them to do, you're changing your identity, and character trumps willpower. So if I say I will never eat chocolate again, for me, chocolate just doesn't belong in my life. For some people, it really does, but for me, it doesn't. If I say I will never eat chocolate again, people say, that's crazy. How can you never eat chocolate again? And I'd say, well, what's the difference between saying I will never eat chocolate again or saying I've decided to become the kind of person who doesn't eat chocolate? The second one is much more palatable and recognizable and easy for people to accomplish because they're used to developing character traits in all sorts of different ways. We have all sorts of unwritten rules that we follow that we don't know. Like if you walk into a diner and there's a $10 bill on the counter because the waitress didn't see her tip, and she says, I'll be right back, I have to get your menu. And there's no video camera, the owner's not up front, there are no windows, nobody would see you take it. Virtually everybody I ask in that situation says, I would never take it. And I'd say, why? You'd be $10 richer, nobody would know. They'll say, well, I'm not a thief. And I say, what do you mean? She said, well, that woman worked hard for her money and I'm not a thief. And I say, well, so as a matter of character, you have an unwritten rule that says, I never steal, I will never steal again, that you'll follow regardless of temptation, which doesn't require any willpower because it's not even an option. See, willpower is required when you have to make decisions, but when decisions are ruled out because you've decided you're not that kind of person, it's not even an option and you don't require willpower anymore. So what I was doing, which actually does result in very positive thinking, was I was purging my negative thoughts from my identity. I was saying, I'm just not the kind of person who eats chocolate. Therefore, I'm not the kind of person that gets out of control with chocolate. Therefore, I am the kind of person who can control myself. I'm not a slave to my impulses. I'm a master of my impulses, and I have self-esteem and self-control. It tends to build up people's self-esteem rather than tear it down. I know it sounds really weird in theory and the abstract. I know there are people listening to the call saying, you've got this psychologist on your call who's got a pig inside him. What are you thinking? So, and actually at the end of the call, I'll tell you where you can download a bunch of free recorded coaching sessions so you can hear how it actually works in practice, because it takes people from feeling despairing and powerless and hopeless to feeling hopeful, enthusiastic, and possible. It actually is transforming and does support positive thinking. It just does it in a really weird way by purging your negative thinking into this artificial entity you can call your food monster or your food demon or your pig or whatever you want to call it, as long as it's not a cuddly pet.
Is overeating, we know that like 60% of the country is overweight and 30% or so, I don't remember the exact statistics, are obese. Obviously, it's a common problem, but what makes it so common? Is that related to the way the food manufacturers, because not everybody had a bad mother, or not necessarily a bad mother, but a disconnect when they were young. What makes it so common?
And just as a side point to what you're saying, adversity in childhood can lead to a strong character as opposed to a weak one. So sometimes you're looking for all of these faults in your parents, but it's those faults that gave you your strength. What makes it such a big problem, in my great big, not so humble opinion, is the evolution of the food substances to push our evolutionary buttons. We didn't have all these bags and boxes and containers on the savannah or in the tropics when we were growing up, when we were evolving. There were no pizzas or pastas or pretzels or chips or chocolate bars, on the trees as we were. And it's only the last few hundred years that these types of things are available. So we really don't have a defense for them. And they're getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's part of it. But then the messaging we get that says that we're powerless and we can't resist. The messaging that says that you really can't control yourself. You just have to eat everything in moderation, eat well 90% of the time, indulge 10% of the time. That messaging conflicts with what we know about willpower, because willpower is a fatigable muscle, which is fatigued by decision making. So if you say, I'm going to eat well 90% of the time and eat badly 10% of the time, every time you're in front of temptation, you have to make another decision about, is this the 10% or this is the 90%? If I say I'll only ever eat chocolate on the last calendar weekend of the month, then 90% of the time my chocolate decisions have already been made, and I don't have to constantly wear down my willpower. So I think people are getting the wrong message. They're also giving the wrong message about the psychology of winning the game. They're told to strive for progress and not perfection, which is a kind-hearted way and the appropriate way to look at the mistakes that you've made in hindsight. But when you're striving for a goal, you actually need to commit with perfection. If an archer is trying to hit the bullseye, they need to pull back the arrow and see the arrow going into the bullseye before they let go of it. They can't be thinking, maybe I'll make it, maybe I won't. They have to be perfectly committed to that flight of the arrow as if it's a foregone conclusion that it's going into the bullseye. If they miss the bullseye, they're not supposed to say, oh my God, I'm a pathetic archer, I'll just shoot the rest of the arrows into the audience or up into the air or whatever. They're supposed to get up and figure out what went wrong, take it seriously, adjust for wind resistance, pull a little further back on the arrow, whatever they need to do, and do it again. If you touch a hot stove, you want to feel that pain for a second, because if you don't, you're never going to know where the hot stove is, so you don't touch it again. But you're not supposed to say, I'm a pathetic hot stove toucher, let me just put my whole hand down on it. You're supposed to take it seriously, make an analysis, make adjustments if you need to, but then let go of the guilt. The perseveration on guilt and shame, the round and round in your head that doesn't go away, that turns out to be pig motivated. What it's trying to do is wear you down enough that you feel too weak to resist the next binge. Oh, you're pathetic. You might as well just give up and be a happy fat person. That's what it's saying. Does that make sense? So the attitude that I recommend is that you commit with perfection, but forgive yourself with dignity. What people are stuck in is pursuing things kind of wishy-washy in a wishy-washy way. Like, oh, gee, honey, I know we're going to get married and I'm pretty sure I can promise to be faithful for the rest of my life, but there sure are a lot of attractive people out there and, progress, not perfection. So they're committing to these goals in a wishy-washy way, which we would never accept in certain situations. And then they're analyzing themselves with too much self-criticism and flagellation. And so the whole thing is a setup for a loss. So you combine that with the food industry and the advertising industry and the messaging about powerlessness, and it's a wonder that anybody can eat well today. But the solution is just a little bit of thought to distinguish exactly what healthy eating means for you. Think about the single worst trigger food or behavior, for example, and make one rule about it. And then listen for yourself, try to break it, and either disempower or ignore that irrational voice while you make sure that you are getting adequate nutrition and calories in your day-to-day life.
When you think about some different, kind of the counter movement to what you're talking about is this health at every size movement, where it's okay, whatever weight you are, as long as you're eating healthy and you're doing healthy things. It's not necessarily about the weight. It's about being healthy. So is what you're doing kind of, or what your book suggests, is kind of that fat shaming yourself in your brain instead of being happy with how you are and healthy if you're eating healthy?
Fat shaming is a problem in our society. And people do come in all different sizes, and I'm thoroughly against people feeling criticized and shamed for their weight. On the other hand, making an objective assessment of what weight is actually healthy, I think the data are pretty clear that it's thinner than the people at Health at Any Size are necessarily suggesting. And so I don't want to support people to be unhealthy. I want to support them to feel loved. I want to support them to love themselves. I want them to embrace a slow journey to where they need to be. But I think we need to take a really hard look at the empirical evidence about where the incidence of disease and disorder is with regards to our weight and set the target accordingly. I mean, our society is way too body obsessed in and of itself. And I think women can be very beautiful at all different sizes, but healthy is a different story. The same thing with what tends to go along with that is this philosophy of intuitive eating and the idea that you can't distinguish between healthy and unhealthy foods, that we have to be able to eat anything at any time and just listen to our insides about it. But the industry is so strong, and they've perverted and hijacked our intuition at such a high level that we can't really trust it. If we lived in the tropics and we didn't have all these bags and boxes and containers, then I think we could trust our intuitions to tell us what to eat. But when it's legal to put flavored cardboard into the food system, and it is, I could show you instances where it's happening, then I think you have to stand up and say, there are some things I will and I won't eat. There are some things that are over the line and unhealthy. There are some things that are healthy. And I can eat intuitively within those guidelines, but I have to draw some boundaries somewhere, somehow. So those are my thoughts about the Health at Any Size movement.
So kind of what you're basically the intuitive eating, feeling good about what you're eating, feeling like taking the time to eat slower and enjoy the food that you have, as long as you can distinguish that trickster or whatever you want to call it in your brain that's trying to tell you that, yeah, this is really good for you, or this is really, or you can, like you said, start your diet tomorrow type thing.
Eating mindfully is really important. And you can make rules that support that. I always put my fork down between bites. I never eat in the car. I never eat with the screen in front of me. You can make rules that support that. For me personally, as long as I don't have industrial food, being thoroughly present while I'm eating is exceptionally important. Letting my food nourish me, experiencing every bite. You wind up eating a little less of it when you do that. But I think that we eat mindfully between the lines, just like we can drive mindfully between the traffic lights. I think that the discipline actually enhances our freedom. You could not get around Manhattan in a car if they didn't have traffic lights and stop signs. There are 11 million people in that place in just a few square miles, and it wouldn't be safe to drive around. It would be too dangerous. And because we have traffic lights and stop signs, people can move. Without that, they'd be stuck. So I actually think that freedom sits on top of discipline. I don't think that the discipline I'm suggesting restricts our freedom. I think it enhances it.
What kind of guidelines do you encourage people to follow?
It's important to make up your own rules. I find that a big part of the problem in food disorders, addiction, even just simple overeating, is a sense of rebellion. There's this part of people inside that says, you can't tell me what to eat. And they go from diet to diet saying, this diet's no good, this diet's no good, I lost weight, but I couldn't stay on it, I lost weight, but I couldn't stay on it, or this one's no good at all. And it's just their pig playing the grass is greener squeal. Oh, that diet's better, this diet's better. And it's really just trying to keep a state of anarchy. So it's very important to take a breath and figure out what rules you want to follow. I suggest people start with one rule. What's your single worst trigger food and behavior? And teach yourself that you're able to follow it. Learn how this game is played. Show yourself that it's possible to structure your mind in that way. And when you hear a craving inside that says, I want to break the rule, you say, I don't want that. My pig does, or I don't want that. My reptilian brain does. It's just squealing for its slop, and I don't eat slop. As crazy as that sounds, it's a commitment. It's a lingual commitment to forming a more constructive identity that's in charge around food. Once you get that, and I would suggest that people don't worry about losing weight in those first few weeks. Once you get that, I suggest that people start to add rules which would help them accomplish their health and fitness goals. I'm not a dietitian, nutritionist, or medical doctor, so I'm not qualified to tell you what to eat. So I always suggest that people consult with them to figure out what their right goal would be, or read books or whatever, but embrace it yourself. And then start to add rules that would help you to lose weight at a half a pound, at the most 2 pounds a week. I really don't like when people lose more than 2 pounds a week because I find it virtually always bounces in the other direction. The reason I think that is because the problem with overeating and binge eating is not just in the overeating, binge eating part of the cycle. It's an addiction to feast and famine. Most people who are struggling with overeating also are really good dieters. So they can lose weight, but then they gain back more. And they get really high during the weight loss period. They get all excited and manic about it. But they're building up this caloric deficit. They're building up a nutritional deficit. And there's some biological mechanism in the brain, I think, and it would make sense from an evolutionary perspective, that if calories and nutrition are unavailable for long periods of time, then as soon as they are available, we have to hoard them. And that's why people feel like someone's pointing a gun at their head and saying, you will eat. That's why people feel like getting too full is a trigger to overeat even more, because it must be a signal to the brain that says, oh, finally calories and nutrition are available. I better take in as much as we can. So to combat that, you want a regular, reliable, steady source of calories and nutrition. You need to eat breakfast the day after a binge. You do not want to make up for a day of binging with 2 or 3 days of fasting or juice only. You want to make up with a binge with a couple of weeks of extremely normal, reliable eating. And that takes you out of this feast and famine cycle and puts you into a more even-keeled, regular cycle with a slight deficit so that you can lose weight, pound, 2 pounds a week at most. That's what I recommend.
So when you talk about a trigger food, how do people identify their trigger food?
What triggers food is the food that you find yourself eating beyond your own best judgment and feel guilty about afterwards. One of the things that I'll give you when you go to my site at the end is a little workbook with a list of all possible trigger foods or all the ones that we identified. And you can kind of go through one by one and give them a rating and figure out if it's a trigger for you. If you're eating, people ask me, how do you define binge eating? Or how do you define, overeating? And I'll say, I don't like to talk about the DSM-5 definition. You can look that up if you want to. But I don't like people thinking in black and white terms, because if you're eating beyond your own best judgment, then wouldn't it behoove you to try this mental trick and see if you can take more control? So I think that the question of is it a binge or not in and of itself is a bit of a squeal, because it's almost like the pig saying, can I get away with it? Can I get away with a little more? You know what I'm saying? So if you're not happy and you're losing control in any way, wouldn't you like to take more control? I'm not going to tell you I'm not going to take anything away from you. You can eat anything you want to. If you want your food plan to say, I eat donuts all day long and that's it, I don't think it's going to last very long, because you're not going to be nutrified, and I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm not going to take that away from you. Nobody's going to tell you what to eat, so there's no reason not to make a rule. You can change them if you want to. We will say, I'll never have chocolate again, but we say that in the same way we present it to the pig as if it's set in stone, in the same way we talk to a 2-year-old. Little Sarah, you can't ever cross the street without holding my hand. Never, ever again. The reason I tell her that, even though I know that I'm lying, because in 5 or 6 years, I will teach her to look both ways and cross by herself. I tell her when she's 2 years old that she can't ever do that because it's too dangerous. I don't want her even thinking about crossing the street. I don't want those images in her head. All I want her to do is razor focus on my hand while we're crossing the street so she gets across safely. Our pigs are like that. They are too dangerous in the context of these trigger foods, so we present these rules to them as if they're set in stone. But if there's a study that comes out that says, if you don't eat chocolate, you're going to die of penile cancer. I'm just making that up. You're going to die of some type of horrible cancer. Of course, I'm going to consider eating chocolate at that point, and I'll change my rules. And once again, I will tell my pig, never again, because it has to be set in stone from the pig's perspective. You don't want it thinking, maybe, how about now? Is it time yet? You can't do that. It's got to be shut up.
You talked a little bit about making your own food plan. How do you help people to make their own food plan? You said you're not going to tell them what to eat, but how do you assemble a good food plan? There
are 4 categories of rules I suggest. There are things you'll never do again. There are things you'll do under certain conditions. I call those conditionals. There are things that you'll always do, and the things that you can do in an unrestricted way. Things you'll never do again are really substances that you want out of your life. I will never eat processed sugar again. I'll never eat chocolate again. Things that you'll do under certain conditions might be, I'll only ever have chocolate at a social event, but no more than once per calendar month. Or I'll only eat pretzels at a Major League Baseball park. Or I don't eat flour during the week, but if I go out to dinner on the weekend, I can have a plate of pasta or 2 pieces of bread, something like that. Those are conditional rules. An always rule is something you always want to do. I always make a hypothetical food plan for the next day before I go to bed. I always drink 2 pure glasses of spring water when I wake up in the morning. I always eat 5 servings of fruit and vegetables every day. Those are always rules. And the unrestricted rules are things that I include so that your pig can't tell you that you're starving. They're things that you can eat in unlimited quantities. I can have all the berries that I want to during the day. I can eat unsauced vegetables in unlimited quantities. I can have all the coffee and tea that I want. Whatever it is for you, you do that to remind yourself that you won't be starving. I have a whole set of examples that I'll give people too, so it's not so confusing, but that's how it works. The main thing is whatever rule you create, you want it to be externally verifiable. Not because you're going to have people check up on you, but because you don't want there to be any wiggle room for your food monster. A rule that people try to make, which isn't really a rule that meets these criteria, is I will never eat when I'm not hungry and I'll always stop when I'm full. That's a guideline. Guidelines are good to have, but they're not enforceable Never Binge Again rules. The reason is that they're too subjective and internal. Your food monster can always say, oh, we're hungry, baby. Believe me, we're hungry. Or we're not full yet. It's not verifiable. If you really want a volume control rule, then you need to say something like, I'll never go back for seconds, or I'll never have more than 1 plate of food, or I will have 3 meals a day with nothing in between, with a meal being 45 minutes from the first calorie to the last. Something like that. You have some type of externally verifiable external control. I'm not saying anybody has to do any of those things. I'm just pointing out for illustration that if 10 people followed you around, they should all agree whether you were on the rule or off the rule. That's how you know that you have a really good rule.
Okay, that's great. So thinking about the listeners who may be dietitians, other health professionals, or even just everyday people interested in nutrition, how would you want them to use this information we've talked about in their day-to-day life?
Well, you're talking about with their clients?
Either with their clients or with themselves, but probably with their clients. Maybe somebody who doesn't necessarily struggle with binging, but they have clients who come in who may have some issues with weight or...
We do have a training and certification program where we teach and supervise people how to work with their own clients like this. It's something we really like to do, actually, because helping the helper really furthers our mission. We're trying to help 1 million people stop binging every year, and they have the clients right in front of them. So that makes us really happy to do that. But in terms of implementing in their own life, I would make the same recommendation that I make to everybody else, which is to start with 1 rule. The other thing that's really important to do is to be sure that the rules that you create don't put you in a box where you can't get enough nutrition and calories. And I would suggest that people check that with a nutritionist or a dietitian or with one of the online systems like Chronometer.com or MyFitnessPal, just to be sure that they're not making a rule that's inconsistent with their body's needs. There are some rules you can't make. I can't make a rule that says, I will never pee again, because my bladder is going to tell me otherwise. If you make a rule which puts you in too much of a caloric or nutritional deficit, your body's going to want to force you to be less discriminating. You can override that. People can go on hunger strikes until they die, but it's extraordinarily uncomfortable and it takes an extraordinary person to do that. So why put yourself in that situation? So go and have your remaining diet checked out by a dietitian or a nutritionist, or at the very least with one of these online calculators to make sure that it's efficient. When you're dealing with a craving, there are a couple of important things to recognize when you're dealing with a craving. First of all, you have to think of the craving as an opportunity. You can't get rid of a craving without having a craving. So a craving is an opportunity to extinguish the craving. If you have a craving and you don't feed it, then the craving will be weaker tomorrow. But underneath the craving is an authentic biological need almost all the time. So it's not just a craving for a chocolate bar, but maybe you genuinely do need some energy. So what I found over time by experimenting with different things was that when I craved chocolate, I would teach my brain, no, we're going to have a kale banana smoothie instead. And I wouldn't get high the same way that chocolate makes you high. I think chocolate is a drug. but I would feel satisfied and the craving would go away. And I would have the energy that I needed. And I think that what I was doing was correcting the biological drive that got hijacked. There's a whole series of animal studies where electrodes were put into the pleasure center, thereby shortcutting or bypassing the natural evolutionary means by which we're meant to experience pleasure. And those animals were allowed to self-stimulate by pressing a lever. So the electrode was wired to a lever. Those animals pressed the lever thousands of times a day to the exclusion of their survival needs. A starving rat, for example, would press the lever thousands of times a day and ignore its food. A nursing mother rat would press the lever thousands of times a day and ignore her pups. So what's happening there is a hijacking of the survival drive. It's an unnatural stimulation of parts of the brain and chemical neurological stimulation that causes the body to make a biological error. I don't think anybody's inserting electrodes in our brain, but the chemicals we're putting into our body, it's not that far away. And can you say we're not being given these shortcuts to biological pleasure when you could walk out of McDonald's and see a Burger King across the street at just about every city in the country or the world these days? So I think you need to recognize that your body is making a biological error. It feels like you need chocolate to survive. It feels like you need chips to survive. At the moment you have the craving, it feels like nothing else matters. No matter how much work you did to think about what you wanted to do, no matter how committed you were to the diet, no matter how much motivational work you figured out why you wanted to commit to this, at the moment of impulse, every bone in your body says, just hand over the chocolate and nobody gets hurt. What you have to do at that moment is say, it's a feeling, and feelings aren't facts. And thank goodness I'm having this feeling now. Thank goodness I'm having this craving now, because I can feed myself what my body really needs. I'm not going to let it go for that chemical electrode in my brain. I'm not going to push the lever thousands of times a day like a stupid rat. Excuse my language. I don't think rats are stupid. I think they're really sweet, but you know what I mean. I am going to forcefully and consciously redirect this drive I'm feeling towards what I think might be my authentic need. Some other examples are when I struggle with pizza or wanting pasta with tomato sauce and Parmesan cheese, what I would do instead was make myself some brown rice with tomato sauce and nutritional yeast. So I started shifting towards healthier alternatives, and I would find the same thing. It wasn't the most delicious thing I ever ate, but it killed the craving and I was fine. And before I knew it, my nervous system was adjusting and I was getting more pleasure out of the brown rice with tomato sauce and nutritional yeast than I was getting out of what I used to remember going to the pasta. Now, if I went back to the pasta, that would revert back to where it was and my body would make the biological error again. So feelings aren't facts. Thank goodness I'm having this craving. What do I really need? That's how you do it.
That's great. I love that idea of basically trying to rewire what your brain wants, so to speak, by just concentrating on it and doing it for a period of time.
Yeah.
So I always ask all my guests, what is your favorite food? Obviously, it's not chocolate, not dark chocolate.
Well, chocolate was my favorite. Chocolate and Cheetos. Those are my favorite foods way back when.
Today?
Of course, when people know what to eat, they want to run away screaming. It took me a lot of years to get to this point. But my favorite thing to do is to make cucumber noodles with a sauce that has tomatoes and lemons and dates and some dulse in it for a little saltiness. That's my absolute favorite thing. And sometimes I'll put some leafy greens into the sauce. And as a matter of fact, I have to go make that after we talk now because I'm hungry. I make a big friggin' bowl of it also. So
cucumber noodles are just slices, really thin slices of cucumbers?
I got a spiralizer. You can get them on Amazon for about $30. And I spiralize it so it's actually like a noodle. So I can actually twirl it. It gives me the same experience of eating pasta. If you're stuck on pasta, it's not going to feel like pasta.
Okay, Dr. Glenn, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. I know my listeners learned a lot about the psychology thoughts behind binge eating and how to make some changes, positive changes. If listeners want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, if you go to neverbingeagain.com and you click on the big red button and sign up for the reader bonus list, there are a few things I can get you. You can get your free copy of the book in digital format, either Kindle, Nook, or PDF. I can get you a free copy of the food plan starter templates we talked about. So regardless of your dietary philosophy, high carb, low carb, ketogenic, vegan, point counting, calorie counting, it doesn't really matter. We have a sample set of food rules that you might want to start with and modify for your own benefit. And I recorded a whole bunch of coaching sessions to show you that this isn't really such a weird or harsh thing in practice as it sounds like in theory. So at neverbingeagain.com, click the big red button.
Great. So guys, this has been another great episode of the Nutrition Experts Podcast, the podcast that is all about learning more so you can do more with nutrition in your life.
You've just listened to an episode of the Nutrition Experts Podcast. Be sure to get more information about this week's episode at www.nutritionexpertspodcast.com. Tune in next time for another great conversation with a nutrition expert and expand your personal knowledge in the field of nutrition, one conversation at a time.